Spectacle is a crucial part of film. Massive sets, huge stakes, epic journeys, and the sheer excitement of seeing a story done on a scale you'd never see in everyday life is part of real movie magic. And spectacle can be created in so many different ways. Sci-fi adventures, biblical epics, swashbuckling romances. But nothing beats disaster movies for the sheer size, scale, and overwhelming production that, once upon a time, brought people in droves to the movie theater. Disaster movies have definitely become passé in the last couple decades, but their sensibilities remain in big-budget blockbuster spectacles, except that they're now part of the background of superhero action or whatever adventure movies are now costing studios $200 million or however much they choose to spend. But once upon a time, these sorts of films ruled the box office, bringing people into theaters in droves to see the latest calamity and the big stars that powered these sorts of movies. Burning buildings, massive earthquakes, planet-killer asteroids, world war, giant monsters, and many more life-shattering calamities have all been brought to life by disaster movies over the decades. And it's our compulsion to experience the worst possible events, realistic or not, that makes disaster movies so fascinating to me. What makes us want to see cities or even the entire world fall apart around us? What are these films trying to tell us about ourselves and our times? And why has the traditional disaster movie essentially gone extinct? This is the birth, life, and death of the disaster movie. The idea of the disaster film can be traced all the way back to 1901 with the very literally titled Fire, which sees a group of firefighters struggling to put out a house fire. And I think that absolutely qualifies as a disaster, even though it is a lot smaller scale than the films that would follow. But its idea of the struggle to survive and overcome something that disrupts everyone's lives would absolutely influence the many films to come, and the disaster movie definitely did not slow down at all over the next century. The first real big disaster movie came in 1933 with Deluge, all about New York City being destroyed by tidal waves, which was quickly followed by King Kong, which really only becomes a disaster movie in its second half as the unleashed ape rampages through New York. New York, by the way, is always targeted in these movies. It's probably the combination of instantly recognizable buildings and a really concentrated population that's really easy to throw a giant fictional disaster at. And you can already see here that disaster movies are trying to balance reality with fantasy in the attempt to keep stories compelling, but also not really bum the audience out too much. As a genre, disaster movies sort of have a little bit of everything. Action, adventure, tragedy, romance, horror, sci-fi, even fantasy. Each disaster movie has a little bit of a different balance between each of these depending on the story. Is it a huge adventure that's set within a larger disaster? It'll probably be pretty fun. Is it a romantic tragedy with doomed lovers torn apart by destruction? It'll probably try to make you cry. Maybe we're really supposed to feel the weight and terror of global catastrophe. It'll up the horror quotient to make us scared of the possibilities. And that's really why the disaster movie is its own genre. Nothing else really has that same blend of stories while kinda reveling in the tragedy of widespread destruction. You can categorize disaster movies into a few different subgenres by the type of incident at the center of the film. Of course, there's natural disasters. Then there's vehicle disasters like shipwrecks or plane crashes. You've got man-made disasters, which can range from building fires to nuclear war. And then, if you really want to raise the stakes, you have sci-fi events that can be world-killing asteroids, alien invasions, or some sort of biblical end of days. Natural disaster movies typically take something that happens in real life and just push it to slightly unrealistic territory. Oh, you've been in an earthquake? Well, this is the biggest earthquake ever. You live in tornado country? Well, what about 2 tornadoes at the same time? You've seen volcano documentaries? Okay, but this volcano is in the middle of Los Angeles. I can see why some people are turned off by these types of movies, especially if they've experienced them in real life. Related but almost its own thing are outbreaks, with pandemic diseases running wild in both realistic and unrealistic ways. On the silly end of the spectrum is The Happening, where, spoilers, plants decide to get back at humans for cutting them or something. On the serious end is Contagion, with a terrifying story marking a deadly pandemic from outbreak to cure. And is there really any greater example of people's morbid curiosity on display than the fact that Contagion got super popular on rental and streaming in the early days of the COVID pandemic? We really are obsessed with our own demises. Of course, there's also movies like The Impossible or The Finest Hours that are based on true events, and can end up being inspiring because the brave actions of the people you see really did happen. Wreck and crash movies to me can become even more visceral because they take something that happens every day all around the world, airplane flights, cruises, train rides, and then take the incidents that only happen every so often and put them on full display. Now, a car crash isn't enough for a disaster movie. Too fast, too small. You gotta have a lot of people going through absolute hell. And that's why I think movies like the Poseidon Adventure or Unstoppable are so effective. These are big, drawn-out disasters with characters you really like, in situations that are just heightened enough to be enjoyable. Personally, outer space disaster movies have always kinda freaked me out. Now, Daddy don't get scared, but I think it's the combination of movies like Armageddon, Deep Impact, and Independence Day, all hitting around the same time and me being way too young when I saw them, that did a number on me. Something about sudden, total destruction that comes out of nowhere and has absolutely nothing to do with the life you've made, yet destroys everyone you know, just seems like a real bad time to me. Post-World War II, you can see the disaster film take on another subgenre within it. Nuclear war. Oh yes, this is a super fun video. It's okay, we're gonna have a little bit more fun in a few minutes. But it makes total sense, as the nuclear proliferation that followed the end of World War II brought about a new fear to the world. The nuclear attacks on Japan revealed a powerful form of destruction that killed hundreds of thousands in an instant, and marked the beginning of the Cold War and nuclear proliferation, where the United States and Russia stockpiled nuclear weapons with the ability to destroy the world. How nuclear fears played out came in a lot of different forms. Obviously, silly stuff like Tarantula, Them, and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms are ways to process fears in very light, weird ways. But there are some truly frightening films about nuclear war. Movies like Threads and On the Beach explore the aftermath. But if I had to pick any nuclear disaster movie that really got under my skin, it's Miracle Mile from 1988. It's a movie about panic breaking out in downtown LA when a potential nuclear war is about to begin, all while our two leads meet and fall in love in the course of one night. Now, I won't spoil what happens by the end, but I think the contrast of falling in love and finding meaning just as the entire world might be ripped apart captures this incredible sense of fear, paranoia, helplessness, and hope that nuclear war creates. That's because there's nothing that our characters can do in these situations. But beyond that, I think you can really split disaster movies into two big groups. Avoidable disasters caused by man's hubris, and natural disasters that remind us of our small place in the world or galaxy. And they play off two distinct societal fears. Man-made disasters center on people pushing the limits of technology and ambition, which then brings about their own destruction. Obviously, these are usually wrecks or crashes or war, but the more sci-fi style movies can have technology creating massive storms that spiral out of control. 1985's The Quiet Earth is all about an experiment that causes almost the entire population of the planet to vanish, leaving only a few people to find meaning in the aftermath. It's a great movie whose small scale lets us focus on the toll of isolation, depression, and connection instead of a big spectacle. Natural disasters are all about people caught in the crossfire of nature's wrath. Sometimes these movies take place in the wilderness, sometimes they're about big cities leveled by the earth. The original Twister is all about people willingly throwing themselves into the path of tornadoes, so they kind of bring it on themselves, but I actually really liked the recent Twisters. Sure, all the Chris Stapleton on the soundtrack helped, but I thought it was easily one of the best disaster movies in recent decades. To me, a great disaster movie escalates, and the structure is pretty simple. You get to know your characters and their everyday lives, there's usually a warning sign that goes ignored, the inciting incident occurs, and things get worse and worse until either the disaster ends by itself, or our heroes solve the crisis. And if there's any reaction that a good disaster movie should spark in audiences, it really comes down to two words. Oh shit. Disaster strikes, things get worse than you could imagine, and the characters you've grown attached to make sacrifices, die unexpectedly, and manage to survive when all hope seems lost. If these things aren't happening in your movie, or if they do happen and the audience doesn't emotionally react, then the movie's not working. It's funny, when you describe a disaster movie with all sorts of peril, thrills, death, and things getting worse and worse, it sounds a lot like a horror movie. But I don't think most people would lump them into the same category. Horror movies scare you, have a personification of evil or death or a specific fear, and have you wait for the next terrible thing to happen. Disaster movies surprise you and try to thrill you throughout the story. The event itself is the antagonist, not a person or thing. This is why zombie movies aren't disaster movies despite their apocalyptic themes. The horror franchise that comes the closest is probably the Final Destination series because every movie opens with a disaster that is avoided by a group of people, and then the horror sets in as they're picked off one by one. And there's truly some great disaster set pieces in those movies, with Final Destination Bloodlines not just having the best disaster, but being the best movie in the series. But they're only a small portion of those films. Really, the disasters of Final Destination are much more like real life. They happen fast, and the survivors are left to pick up the pieces in the aftermath. No one wants a full-on disaster movie where the actual incident is maybe 5 minutes max. We want long, drawn-out incidents where characters struggle to survive. Maybe that's a little grim, but I think it speaks to audiences' need to see the human will and desire to live and succeed on full display, as well as our want for the human spirit to endure. Going back to disaster movie history, the 1960s has a smattering of stuff, with a few that are still somewhat popular like Flight of the Phoenix, a plane crash story, The Day the Earth Caught Fire where, well, you know, and of course The Birds, which, while the disaster is kinda silly, the terror comes from never truly understanding why it all happened. If there's a golden age of the disaster film, it's absolutely the 70s. Airport in 1970, The Poseidon Adventure in 1972, and both Earthquake and The Towering Inferno in 1974. You can really see the formula solidify here. Very specific disaster, airplane crash, tidal wave, fire, and earthquake, but set in a fairly small location for the sake of saving some budget, while still really being able to have big effects, and a star-studded cast. Either you're watching the movie for the spectacle, or for the stars you like, preferably both. If you have any doubt that this was the disaster golden age, then I only need to point you to the fact that The Poseidon Adventure was nominated for 9 Academy Awards and won 2, while The Towering Inferno was nominated for 8 Academy Awards and won 3. There's really only one disaster movie made a few decades later that received this type of prestigious reaction, and that's it. You're not exactly expecting a wave of awards for frickin' Geostorm these days. But more on the sorry state of modern disaster movies in a few minutes. The Poseidon Adventure is honestly a very nihilistic and dark film that's much more about questioning the reason behind suffering and death than you'd expect from a movie with adventure in the title. The late great Gene Hackman as a reverend that comes to question God in the midst of disaster is pretty amazing here. And The Towering Inferno is awesome. Great big sets and stunts with fire, but best of all is how much the movie highlights the heroism of firefighters, as well as the people caught in the blaze. Plus you've got Paul Newman and Steve McQueen. That's a hell of a combo. Afterward, you can kinda see big Hollywood studios speedrunning every kind of disaster on screen to catch the wave of audience interest. And it's all a little uninspired. You can just kinda tell by the titles. Hurricane, City on Fire, Airport 1975, Meteor, and lots of sequels where that once-in-a-lifetime calamity just kinda happens again. So it shouldn't really come as a surprise that the 80s was a major downturn for disaster movies, with studios moving more toward full-on sci-fi and horror instead of big expensive spectacle when all the major crazy scenarios have been played out. Airplane in 1980, which heavily parodies Airport and the well-known disaster tropes, really put an end to the classic disaster movie at this point. A brief note on kaiju and giant monster movies. Honestly, I don't think that most of them qualify as actual disaster films. And of course, I'm going to use this opportunity to talk a little bit more about Godzilla. You can't stop me, you're not my real dad. But I don't think that most Godzilla movies should really be considered full-on disaster movies. Yes, there's lots of destruction, but that's all kinda background to the action and sci-fi aspects of these movies. Of course, Ishiro Honda's original Gojira is a true disaster movie, and that's because the film is really trying to process the trauma of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, with the deaths and losses caused by Gojira front and center, giving it real weight and relevance in ways few other Godzilla movies have. Along with the original, I would put movies like GMK, Godzilla 98, Edwards' Godzilla 2014, Doherty's King of the Monsters, Shin Gojira, and Minus One as true disaster movies where the destruction caused by Godzilla and his fellow kaiju is often seen from the human perspective, putting the disaster front and center alongside the kaiju spectacle. On that same note, Cloverfield, Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris, The Host, and Q the Winged Serpent are also just as much disaster movies as they are giant monster movies. And these movies have that weight and impact added to them that a lot of other monster movies don't have. These are earth-shaking incidents that people have to fight to survive. Replace the monster with a hurricane or a flood or a fire, and the story doesn't really change all that much. And that brings us to the 90s, which I think is really the second heyday of the disaster film. Twister, Independence Day, Speed, Daylight, Dante's Peak, and Volcano, Turbulence, Hard Rain, Deep Impact, and Armageddon. I would even argue that Jurassic Park is a disaster movie because it's all about nature reasserting itself over man's arrogance. Most of these were big hits, and with box offices come more studios looking to cash in. It's a self-perpetuating cycle, and with CGI really proving itself in the early 90s, and showing how these events can be bigger than ever on screen, you get this huge resurgence. And the film that stood as the highest grossing movie in film history for decades is absolutely a disaster film. 1997's Titanic. Now, making a movie based on a real-life tragedy is always going to be tricky and feel like a studio profiting off the loss of life. But Titanic is far from the first movie to depict the real-life shipwreck. As far back as 1912, only 31 days after the Titanic sank, the silent film Saved from the Titanic premiered. That's insane. Just a month earlier, more than 1,000 people lost their lives, and now we got a movie dramatizing the whole dang thing. I couldn't tell you what the time frame is for when a movie can appropriately dramatize a real-world disaster. It all depends on the incident and movie, but I would say it's definitely more than 1 year. And the near century by the time Cameron's Titanic arrived is obviously fine. A Night to Remember from 1958 was probably the definitive Titanic movie for decades. But James Cameron's epic dramatization is really just the right approach at just the right time, prioritizing the completely fictional romance for much of the film before moving on to the disaster we all know is coming. And by doing so, we can be sad, moved, excited, and frustrated, while having a little bit of remove from the real-world tragedy. And Titanic really is a fantastic movie. Oh wow, hot take there. Melodramatic and at times cheesy, but the romance is as enjoyable as the disaster, and they make each other better because of the tragedy. And people ate that stuff up. Released in 1997, Titanic would make more than $1 billion worldwide in its first year of release, and go on to make more than $2 billion after many more re-releases and showings. What's funny is that you don't really see any true copycats of Titanic in the years after. You're not seeing big-budget disaster epics regarding the sinking of the Lusitania. The closest thing we got was Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, which tries to do the fictional romance within real-world tragedy thing, but that movie blows. Instead, movies like Armageddon, with huge casts of famous faces and insanely high stakes, become much more of the norm. Disaster movies in the 21st century really take a turn toward the massive and fantastical, and I think it's the direct result of a lot of real-life disasters and war having more and more media coverage, and terrorist attacks becoming a real source of fear around the globe. People don't want to see realistic plane crashes and floods when we're seeing actual lives lost on the daily news. So instead what we got was The Day After Tomorrow, The Core, Pompeii, Geostorm, San Andreas, Moonfall, 2012, The Happening, and a lot of other movies whose disaster premises are so fantastical and improbable that it's essentially fantasy. These are movies whose world-shattering events trigger or could trigger post-apocalyptic scenarios. Now, the post-apocalyptic movie is its own whole can of worms that I don't want to fully open here, but unless it's the most hellish, torturous scenario, there's always a degree of wish fulfillment to them. And the same goes for the type of disaster movie that centers on an apocalypse. You don't really think about the reality of the situation because it's so far from everyday life, so you inevitably start to think about how you would survive. Guy like me, I just surf that mile-high wave. Oh, an alien invasion? Nah, I'd win. See, it's not really all that interesting. Now, every disaster movie seems to be as big and wild as a studio could dream, but audiences are becoming pretty numb to it all. There was a time when disaster movies were consistently among the highest grossing films of every year. The Towering Inferno, The Poseidon Adventure, Jurassic Park, Speed, Independence Day, Twister, Armageddon, Deep Impact, The Perfect Storm, Pearl Harbor, and of course Titanic were all at the top of the yearly charts. But it's been a quarter of a century since their true dominance, and in the time since, only San Andreas in 2015 and Twisters in 2024 have been among the top 20 earners. They've been replaced by franchises, superheroes, sci-fi, and other high concepts made with big budgets. Of course, that hasn't stopped studios from making them, but the big swings are fewer and further between. Looking back on the progression of the disaster movie over the decades really highlighted for me the death of the traditional movie star in film. This is something that's been spoken a lot about over recent years, but I think the disaster film really shows it to be true. People don't show up in big droves just for a specific actor like they used to. Instead, they come for concepts, stories, or known franchises. So a disaster movie really has to sell itself on something big and wild happening, which has inevitably led to these movies getting crazier and crazier and not to their own benefit. Disaster movies also really play into the whole practical versus CGI effects debate as well. You know, I'm not really one to always pick one over the other. If something can be done well practically, I'll happily go for that over CGI. But some things simply can't be done with sets and stunts. A movie like Titanic wasn't possible until Cameron was confident that CGI could bring the sinking ship to life in the ways he wanted, and it still looks spectacular. However, over-reliance on CGI means that these movies naturally get bigger and bigger. The disaster goes from a city falling apart to the world itself crumbling to pieces. It's no longer about escaping one building, but surviving every single disaster endlessly thrown at our characters. And the fact of the matter is that these events no longer have any connection to reality. So the stakes don't matter and the fear isn't real and you really don't care what happens to these people. And I think that really speaks to the appeal of disaster movies and why they've essentially gone out of style. These movies are escapism, but they're also intensely reflective of the fragility and danger of our societies, our environments, our homes, and our lives. Turn on the news and you see it all the time. Homes destroyed, natural disasters wiping out neighborhoods and cities, wild speculation about asteroids, wildfires, and earthquakes. Human beings innately have a negativity bias. We don't just react more strongly to negative stimuli, we linger on the worst things that people have said to us, we remember tragic incidents from our past much more clearly, and we use tragic incidents that we see as a learning tool for our own survival. Now obviously that is super important when it comes to surviving as a species, but it really does wreak havoc on our emotions and thoughts in daily life. Positive stimuli sort of just recede from our memory, but the negative remains. And while we all wish that we could focus on the good rather than the bad, it is the bad that stays with us. Disaster movies are really playing off this in such a strong way because these are our fears and these are the things that linger with us long after they have gone far into the past and after the news has stopped covering the most tragic incidents in the world. However, when I think about what I like most about these films, I can't help but think of a quote from the wonderful Fred Rogers. My mother used to say, a long time ago, whenever there would be a catastrophe in the movies or on the air, always look for the helpers. There will always be helpers, even just on the sidelines. That's why I think if news programs could make a conscious effort of showing rescue teams, of showing anybody who is coming into a place where there's a tragedy, to be sure that they include that. Because if you look for the helpers, you'll know that there's hope. I think that most disaster movies are built on hope and survival. Sure, there's some films that end with everyone being wiped out and that take on a more nihilistic approach.
Oh, that must be exhausting.
But despite the losses and tragedies, the classic disaster movie ends with our characters surviving, conquering seemingly impossible odds, and moving forward with their lives in the hope of something better. It's often bittersweet, but I think that really reveals what people have wanted from these movies in the past. To acknowledge that life is filled with loss, but that there's much more to life than just that. Our survival is made more meaningful by our losses. Each day seems brighter when knowing that the end can come at any time, and the world continues to spin on after everything seems to come to an end. Personally, I don't think that life is a series of incidents that grind you down until the end. Yes, there are hard times, and the dark periods in life seem to last forever, but they do come to an end, and life goes on. The fact is, we often are permanently changed by these times in our life. Sometimes we're darker people, more negative, but we're always stronger for them. But no matter who you are by the end of them, you're someone who deserves the life that's ahead of you. Take that life and live it to the fullest, because the world is not kind enough to give everyone that chance. Thanks for watching today's video, and this is me fulfilling a promise that I made all the way back at the beginning of this year. You might remember that I kicked off 2025 with Disney's The Black Hole, and in that video I briefly touched on disaster movies in the context of that sci-fi film, and I mentioned that I might want to cover disaster movies as a whole in its own video, and people did seem interested, so now here it is. I'm not a huge fan of disaster movies overall as just a genre, but there are quite a few movies within the genre that I really do like. And during the extended time that I slowly researched this video, I actually ended up watching the Poseidon Adventure and Towering Inferno for the first time ever, and I really liked them. I thought they were excellent, and they were a nice mix of classic Hollywood spectacle and that modern disaster big budget structure. They're really great, and if you enjoyed this video and haven't seen them, I say definitely check them out. I'm really not a fan of these modern, CGI-heavy, crazy, planet-destroying disaster movies. I just think that they're too big to even care about anymore. And I would really like for these movies to sort of scale them back a bit. I didn't mention in the video, but a movie that's sort of half disaster and half horror is Crawl, which is from about 5 years ago. And I think that does a really good job at portraying disaster on a really small scale. And of course, alligators end up being the true horror villains, but the whole hurricane and flood aspect of it is a great disaster piece. I'd love to hear what some of your favorite disaster movies are, as well as other larger genres that you'd like for me to cover in future videos. As always, a huge thanks to my members and patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and staying prepared.